Welcome to Highly Sensitive, Happily Married, the podcast that teaches you to not only have an easier marriage as a sensitive woman, but to have one that feels more amazing by the day. Where you'll hear relatable stories, love advice that works, and coaching on how to have a marriage where feeling upset and disconnected is a thing of the past, and where instead a sense of loving connection and even fun and lightness is the norm. I'm Hannah Brooks, highly sensitive person, love expert, and marriage coach, and I'm so happy to be on this journey with you. Hello, my friends, and welcome to episode 111, where we are going to talk about using anger effectively in our relationships. And I'm calling this episode Strategic Anger because there are ways in which we can use anger that are very unstrategic. And this is way more common than the other way, which is what I think of as using anger strategically. Now, in my work, I tend to talk with and work with a lot of people who are in what I call the phase of disenchantment in their relationship. So I'm going to be talking about this a lot more over the coming weeks, and I made a whole podcast about it. I think it's called the 3 Phases to Mature Love, something like that. But in this, there's the initial phase usually in our relationships where we're just so in love and everything's so wonderful, right? I call that infatuation. And then the second phase is this disenchantment land where things just feel more blah, right? Things feel hard, or, the rosiness of everything has faded to some other less pretty colors. And one of the hallmarks of this phase is there's more anger, there's more irritation, there's more annoyance, there's more frustration, along with less of those feelings of connection and closeness and intimacy and love and passion and attraction and all of that, right? So as I've said before, this is a phase that many of us find ourselves in and feel really bad about and sad about, and we also tend to get stuck in. All right. The whole reason I brought that piece in is because of the anger element that can happen here. And what can sometimes happen, what I've seen often is it's in this phase that we start falling into maybe overusing anger. Or feeling a lot of anger and resentment and frustration, right? And then expressing it in one way or another. So my question to you right off the bat here is, are you overusing the expression of anger in your relationship? And again, this can look like bigger expressions of anger or even just smaller, more right? Kind of things. So often we as highly sensitive women are, whether it's like this outright kind of red hot anger, right? Or this simmering background sort of sludgy anger of resentment. And I think like unconsciously what's going on here, the reason that anger in these various forms shows up so much is because somewhere in us we're believing it will get us what we want. It's a defense strategy, a protection strategy. And you'll hear me talk about other protection strategies. In fact, we've talked a lot about them. I may not have used that term. But we have all sorts of defense mechanisms or defense or protection strategies that we fall back on that actually just don't work. I usually just call these backfiring tactics. But they are sort of this unconscious way of trying to get something we want, right? And anger is one of them, or expressing anger in certain ways is oftentimes one of these backfiring tactics. Now, sometimes expressing anger is the most powerful medicine for shifting things in our marriage. And I really wanted to make sure I said that, and we talk about this in more depth. But the truth is, it rarely is the thing we really need to make the positive changes we want or to get the things we want in our relationship. And it's only that medicine, anger is only that good medicine for shifting things in our marriage when it's what I call responsive anger instead of reactive anger. And when we use that anger strategically. So let's talk about why. If you are really like often angry at your significant other for little things he's done here or there, and you're expressing it in one way or another, which, let's just be real, if you're angry, you are expressing it in your body language and your behavior, even if you think you're hiding it. Because if it's really going on for us, right, if we're fuming, we can't really hide it truly. So other people will pick up on that. Your partner will sense it, whether he's fully cognizant of it or not. Okay. So if you are angry regularly and it's showing, you're really not going to be able to harness the power of effective anger in the moment, in the times when it could actually fuel some positive change. Like, here's a simple metaphor that will help make this more sense. Help this make more sense. Imagine that you have a bucket that has lots of holes in it, right? It's not going to have enough water in it because it's going to be leaking to ever be effective in putting out an actual fire. All that energy that could create real change, right, if the bucket didn't have holes in it, is currently leaking out through the holes. Right, so that's kind of the same thing. Maybe that's not a perfect metaphor, but like when we're leaking our anger left and right, it won't be as potent when it's really important. Our partner will get immune to it and shut down by it. Now, when you use anger strategically, which in this case I mean rarely and effectively, right? It can actually do some good in your marriage and really help to get a powerful message through to your partner. But in most cases, at least the way most of us handle our anger, it does the opposite, right? Anger will do the opposite. And you may have experienced this. Frequent and reactive anger will almost always backfire, right? If you have been someone who's irritated a lot or kind of like a lot, or you do react fairly angrily often, what's going to happen over time is you're going to start seeing your partner most likely stop wanting to do what you want him to do. He'll probably start going on the defensive. He's probably not going to be able to hear you very well, more and more. And, that kind of anger, frequent anger, will invite his angry reaction back at you and make him more likely to harden and close off to you. It will likely make him feel like he can't do anything right by you, and eventually lead to a sense of defeat and shut down his desire to even try to give you what you want. And yes, I speak from personal experience here, very painful personal experience. So in simplest terms, frequent reactive anger backfires. It makes our relationship worse. It pushes away what you most want, which I'm guessing is intimacy, love, and loving connection in a sense of like allyship or teammanship, right? So this happens because of two things. Not because anger is bad, but because of these two things. Most of us only know reactive anger, meaning we feel anger and we react from it, which looks like raising your voice, snapping, blowing up, swearing, name-calling, insulting, right? This could be really big or not quite so big, right? Blaming, shaming, guilting, giving the silent treatment, being passive-aggressive, kind of tit for tat behavior, right? I call that sometimes eye for an eye behavior. And you'll know, my friend, as a sensitive person, when you're in reactive anger because you feel out of integrity when you're acting out of that reactive anger. It doesn't feel like aligned with your values and who you most want to be. So that's the first thing, reactive anger. The second thing is that we overuse anger. The second reason why it backfires is because we overuse it, right? We stay in it, we indulge in it, we act from it instead of moving through and out of it into other emotional states of being that actually serve our relationship and ourselves better. And I think that these two things, like the fact that we oftentimes end up in reactive anger and we overuse anger in general in our relationships, is because anger tricks us into believing it's our helper. Our primal brain, our lizard brain, thinks, at least on an unconscious level, that reactive anger is the thing that's finally going to get our partner to understand how his actions are causing us pain and problems, right? And it's going to be the thing that's going to finally get him to be who we want him to be. I see this all the time with my clients who are kind of caught in anger. Somewhere in them, they're like, this is going to make it better. This is going to make him change. This is going to make him love me better. But the opposite is usually what happens, right? It's not true. It almost never is effective. It almost always creates the opposite of what we want when we're overusing anger and we're in reactive anger. So in order to resolve and improve things in your relationship, I really never encourage indulging in anger or reacting from it. Instead, I encourage you to consciously move through your anger. It's not bad to have angry feelings, right? That's definitely not what my message is here. But I encourage you to move through that anger, support yourself in shifting it and letting that fiery red hot energy of it move through before you bring it in any shape or form to your partner, before you bring anything up with him, before you interact with him. And I'd like to right now, instead of giving you a whole process for that, I'm going to point you to 3 different podcast episodes. If you're interested in what is that, how do I move through that red hot energy? How do I consciously support myself through it? So if you missed episode 106, just a few back, definitely check that one out. This is especially for if you find that anger's you feel a lot of resentment and it's kind of like a hardened, it feels kind of solidified into your marriage and you just really don't know how to move beyond what I call grievance or resentment. So that episode is called Grievance, the Biggest Barrier to a Loving Marriage. It's a really important one. And then episode 36 and 37, they're kind of a pair. They go together. The 36 is called Calming Emotional Reactivity for HSPs. And episode 37 is called How to Feel Safe to Feel Any Feeling. And they're going to help you learn a little bit more about these big emotions that we have and how to process them through and move through them so that they aren't so intense, right? So that you can work with them more effectively and sort of be in a responsive space instead of a reactive space. I'm going to put those direct links in the show notes. So if you want to just go to the show notes, you can click directly to these episodes. Now we'll talk about this a little bit more in a few minutes, but I just felt like I wanted to make sure I mentioned it here to prevent the problems that frequent and reactive anger can lead to. For most of us, it means putting in the work to move out of our reactive aggressive anger habits. So yes, this means learning how to kind of, like I said, support ourselves through it in the moment. I call this processing our emotions in the moment. But it also means looking at the things that are getting in your way that are creating the anger in the first place. And by this, I don't mean the things that your partner is doing, but the ways in which things inside of you are relating to that in a way that kind of exacerbates your anger, your thoughts, your perceptions, your old beliefs, your old conditioning. This stuff can really flare our anger out of proportion to what actually happened or what's happening. And for most of us, there's a lot of those, a lot of this stuff. And so there is some work to do there. If you don't want anger to be such a force in your marriage and such a force of, creating more of the distance and separation and the things that you don't want in your marriage. But like I said, anger can be a good thing in your marriage. So let's look at that. When does anger work for you in a relationship? So here are some things. 1, if it's used rarely. 2, when and if you've tried all the other approaches and they haven't worked, which if you're listening to this, I can almost guarantee you have not yet tried all the other things. Just because there are a lot of other options. And most of us are what's the word? Ensnared by anger, right? It's just like such a tempting place to go. And third, it can work if you are not reacting from it, but transforming it from aggression or reactive anger into healthy or responsive anger. In other words, anger is a last resort to make powerful changes in your marriage. But if it comes to that last resort, when you know how to harness your anger effectively, it can be powerfully effective. It can be really the thing that finally does get through to your husband, that can finally fuel change on his end. I'm suddenly seeing another useful metaphor here, which is like fire is amazing when we harness that fire, right? When we put it in a fire pit or we put it in a stove, right? Or we have it in a sort of contained way. Fire is such a force for good when we are using it effectively. But fire can also be such a destructive force, right? Think wildfires that are not intentional and out of control, right? So the fire of anger can be very, very powerful. And for me, it has been effective in my marriage. And I've also used it very ineffectively. And I know intimately the poor results it leads to for both ourselves and our partners, right? Like my unskillfulness with anger in my first marriage, like I was making both the mistake of being in reactive anger and doing that often. And it created a huge wedge in my own heart, but also between me and my husband that eventually really eroded our desire to stay in that marriage and led to our divorce. And even with my husband now, in the past, it has really led to temporary impasses that could have been avoided. Now, I'm much more likely nowadays to use responsive anger and instead of reactive anger. And I attribute some of those huge strides and breakthroughs we've made in our marriage's happiness to my skillful use of responsive anger. For example, my husband's huge strides in the last year at being able to really listen with loving presence and to truly hear me, that's been a beautiful breakthrough. And it's come about because of my use, my skillful use of responsive anger. So what is responsive, i.e. healthy anger? What's it feel like? What's it look like? So you can probably get a good sense of it just by the name, right? It's a response. It's like we're responding instead of reacting, right? It's not fast or urgent. Instead, responsive anger is calm, it's direct, it's solid, it's grounded. It's not attacking or shaming or blaming or guilting, right? It's not aggressive. It's not coming from that fight or flight place inside of you. So that might be the biggest clue for you. Responsive anger is available to you by bringing yourself to nervous system regulation, like more into the parasympathetic state of calm and connect, right? You're not going to be really in that fight or flight state. Maybe a little, but definitely not too much. If you are, you're in aggressive or reactive anger. So again, what that's going to mean is supporting yourself through those initial fiery red hot feelings of anger that might flare up in you, right? Supporting yourself through them until they're no longer going to burn anyone, until they're no longer burning inside you, right? Until the intensity has passed and you found yourself back at a really centered place. Now, side note, this is why the HSP timeout, that's why I'm such an advocate for it. One of the reasons. Which reminds me, I made a video all about that HSP timeout. Such an important tool. No highly sensitive person should live without it. So I'm going to put that link in the show notes too, the direct link to that video. So you've got to check that one out. I like to think of responsive anger kind of as mama bear energy or like fierce love, because healthy responsive anger is pro-love. It is for making things better, for setting limits that are healthy for you and your partner, or bringing energy to like a stagnant place. For example, like when we say, no, we don't hit to a child, right? When they're hitting your other child, for example, right? Or when we say something like, honey, this is essential. It's time to focus on this. So like a stern voice is okay. Like that is actually a normal part of responsive anger. Think of it more as a strong, empowered voice, right? A powerful voice. So another example might be if you're having a conversation, this is like my experience recently. If you're having a conversation with your partner and you've asked him to like, please just listen for a little while, and he's not, you can tell like he's interrupting or whatever. Responsive anger might say something like this: I've asked you to listen. It's time to listen, honey. So it can be stern, it can be strong. And it's beautiful because it can help you know when to set boundaries, right? That's what responsive anger can do. Instead of blowing things up and like needing to set boundaries everywhere, it can be more discerning about what's actually needed. And it can help you command attention to something that deserves and needs to change and help move it in a more love-filled direction. So it really can be a loving choice for both of you. So anger is a good emotion that can bring true benefits into your relationship. It can truly preserve and help you create things that deeply matter to you. But one reason I'm not going into super depth on it is because I don't want you to start with anger as a means to make change, and definitely not reactive anger. I don't even advise that you use it as a second or third or fourth or fifth strategy to create change. I almost didn't want to share with you much yet about responsive anger because I don't want you starting with anger as a means to make your relationship better. Because again, I see the ravaging effects that it has on relationships all the time. So what I recommend for real change in your marriage that sticks is you doing the inner work needed to prevent and let go of the unnecessary anger that keeps backfiring. So you can land back in your heart and in your centered self, which is the only place you can effectively create and advocate for the loving marriage you want. Do you remember the second of the 3 things you must do to have an amazing marriage? Right? I boiled it down in a recent episode to only the 3 things you must be able to do to have an amazing marriage. And if you missed that episode, it's episode 105. You've got to have a listen. So that second thing that you must do to have an amazing marriage is to know how to move through and out of negative emotions that block love if you're stuck in them. And then the third thing is to be able to move into emotions that foster love and connection that keeps increasing. So responsive anger can be that second category, or number 3, right? It can be part of those emotions that foster love. But reactive anger, you're going to want to learn how to move through and out of that, because it will hurt your love if you're stuck in that. And of course, if you really want your husband to do something different, or to stop doing something, or to start doing something, right? Like, try the other way more effective approaches before you resort to any anger. That doesn't mean you're not allowed to have anger, right? But support yourself through and out of that anger. And then communicate differently. Make requests. Come from more ownership and more vulnerability, right? There are so many other strategies than anger. So in this podcast, like this whole podcast, I talk about all different strategies, all sorts of different strategies you can use. So there's a lot here to help with that. And if you are going to use anger, if anger is still there at times for you, and again, there's so much inner work you can do to really help yourself overcome it and melt it and prevent it altogether. But make sure you're doing what you need to do to shift it into responsive anger instead of reactive anger. So to help you melt excess and unnecessary anger over the coming weeks, we're going to be looking at various things that cause a lot of the resentment and the anger and the irritation, etc., right? Hard emotions, these types of emotions. We're going to be looking at different things, including perfectionism and what I call marriage perfectionism, and the difference between making excuses for your partner's bad behavior and true acceptance, or what I call empowered acceptance. So we're going to be looking at that and various other things that are going to support you in melting and no longer having so much anger that you have to work through. So I'm really looking forward to diving into more of all these things that leads us into this stage of marriage that you may be in, this disenchantment place, right, that so many of us get stuck in, where we feel more dullness and annoyance, etc., right, that I talked about earlier. This phase that you actually can move through and out of so you can feel what I call re-enchanted in your marriage, with your partner, right? Loved and in love again, but in a fuller, deeper, more evolved, more sustainable, more mature, more yummy, lasting way. So you can have what I call an amazing marriage for the long haul. So definitely stay tuned this spring as we cover all sorts of things about this. And if you know right now that you're ready to make some true, deep changes that really work to make your marriage feel like one you love and one that you feel loved in as well, this is actually your last chance to come coach with me in a purely one-on-one container, at least for the foreseeable future. Because big news, things are changing around here in really good ways. But it involves me no longer doing purely one-to-one client work. I have something so fun coming, but I'm not quite ready to say more. It's not quite time. But I do have one more one-on-one spot left where we work purely one-on-one for 6 months, where I'll guide you to address the challenges in your marriages in ways that are so much more love promoting than anger and than any of the things you may have been doing, so that you'll become masterful at the most skillful, effective, team-oriented ways to create the change you want in your marriage, including when and how to harness just the right amount of healthy, responsive anger to fuel the most potent, powerful, positive change in your marriage. It starts by setting up that consult with me. And I will put a direct link in the show notes, or you can go to www.lifeisworthloving.com and click the Get Started with a Call button. All right, my lovely, sensitive friends, be oh so well.